Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we're stepping into something that's harder to define. Not fully asleep, not fully awake. Not sleep paralysis. There's a kind of experience people describe where the body stops responding, but awareness stays active. And then something else happens. The sense of being moved, lifted, pulled out of place. Sometimes it feels like you're still in the room. Sometimes it feels like you're somewhere else entirely. And in those moments, it's not always clear where you are anymore. In your body or outside of it. It's often explained in different ways, but the experience itself tends to follow a pattern. And once you've felt it, it's very hard to forget. There's a specific kind of experience that shows up across a lot of different descriptions. It doesn't always start the same way, but it usually begins close to sleep. That in-between state where awareness is still there but control isn't fully in place. The body feels distant, heavy, or completely unresponsive. That part overlaps with what's often described as sleep paralysis. But sometimes it doesn't stop there. Sometimes the experience shifts. And instead of being stuck in place, it feels like you're not in place at all. People describe the sensation of movement. Not physical movement, but something else. Almost a kind of separation. Like the point of awareness isn't anchored to the body anymore. And when that happens, the environment changes. The room looks the same. The layout is familiar. But your perspective is different. Maybe it's higher. Maybe it's lower. Offset in a way that doesn't match where your body should be. There are accounts of people feeling like they've floated upward toward the ceiling, maybe toward a corner of the room, looking down at a space they recognize, but from a position they've never occupied before. In some cases, there's a sense of control, slow movement, drifting, almost like learning how to navigate a space without the usual constraints. But in other cases, it's the opposite. Fast, disorienting, uncontrolled, more like being moved than moving. That distinction matters a lot because it changes how the experience feels. If you're in control, it can feel exploratory. If you're not in control, it feels like something is happening to you. And that is where the tone shifts from curiosity to something closer to fear. I've had moments where it felt like the room itself was still there, still structured, still recognizable, but I wasn't interacting with it the way I normally would. Not walking, not standing, just present, in a different position. There was a moment in college where it felt like I had moved beyond the normal limits of the space. Up past the door frame, across the hall, into another room. And everything looked the same. People talking, a conversation happening. Nothing was out of place, except for the fact that I was there without being seen. Close enough to hear. Close enough to feel like I was part of it. But completely disconnected from it all the same time. There wasn't fear in that moment. More like observation, a strange kind of distance, like watching something from inside the room instead of outside of it, but not being able to interact with it, not being able to signal that you're there. That's one version of it. There's another where the experience isn't quiet or observational. It's immediate. It's fast and harder to orient yourself inside of. I had a period of time where sleep was very inconsistent, very limited, and those in-between states were happening more often. The environment was different. A room without windows, completely dark. The kind of darkness where there's no reference point at all once the light goes out. And in that space, the experience changed. It didn't feel like drifting. It felt like being pulled. Suddenly, without warning, one moment in my bed, the next suspended in the corner of the room. Not slowly rising, not easing into it. Instant, like being launched out of position. And from that perspective, everything was visible. The room, the layout, even the sense of where my body should have been. At the same time, there was another layer. The awareness of still being in the bed. Not visually, but internally. Like 2 points of reference existing at the same time. That's where it becomes difficult to describe, because language is built around singular perspective, being in one place, seeing things from one position. But this wasn't that. It was split. Part of the experience anchored, part of it moving. And then the movement accelerated from one corner of the room to the other corner of the room, and then across the room at a speed that didn't feel controlled, more like being moved than choosing to move. That's when the emotional tone shifted, because speed changes perception. It removes the ability to process what's happening in real time. It creates a sense of loss of control. And that loss of control tends to trigger something deeper, a kind of instinctive response. Fear. Not tied to a specific threat, but to the experience itself. The lack of stability, the lack of control, the sense that something is happening without your input. And in that moment, the question isn't, what is this? It's, how do I stop this? But there isn't always a clear way to do that, because the usual methods don't apply. You can't move your body. You can't reorient yourself physically. You're inside something that doesn't follow the same rules, so the experience plays itself out. Movement, stillness, shifts in perspective, until eventually it stops. And when it does, it doesn't taper off. It resets. Back in the bed, back in the body, with the room exactly where it should be. No movement, no shift, just the after effect and the memory of how real it all felt, which leaves a question behind, not necessarily about what it was, but about how the mind is able to produce something that feels that complete. Now, let's pause for a moment. Have you ever experienced this feeling? Some call it astral projection. If you have, I would love to hear about your experience. And if you had a peaceful experience where you were in control, or if you had a scary experience where you didn't feel like you were in control, please let us know in the comments below wherever you might be listening tonight. Or feel free to give us a call and leave us a message on our hotline, the Midnight Drive, 402-610-2836. Now, when an experience like that ends, the first thing that comes back is control. The body responds again. You can move your hands, sit up, look around. The room is where it's supposed to be. Nothing is out of place, and that contrast is immediate. A moment ago, everything felt unstable. Now, it's fixed, solid, familiar. But the feeling doesn't reset as quickly as the environment does. There's a delay. A few seconds where the body is back, but the mind is still catching up. Trying to place what in the world just happened. Trying to decide how to categorize it. That's where interpretation begins. Not during the experience, after it. Because during the experience, there isn't space for analysis. It feels real, immediate, complete. There's no distance between what's happening and how it's understood. It just is. But once it ends, that distance returns, and the mind starts to sort through it all, looking for something to anchor to, a label, a framework, a way to file it into something that makes sense. And that's where things start to diverge, because people don't all reach for the same explanation. Some describe it as a dream that extended too far, something that crossed over into waking awareness. Others describe it as a form of dissociation. The mind separating from the body under certain conditions. Fatigue, stress, interrupted sleep. States where the usual boundaries aren't as stable. There are also people who describe it as something intentional, not internal, something happening to them, a presence, a force, a kind of interaction that isn't under their control. That interpretation shows up often enough to notice. Not as a confirmed explanation, but as a pattern in how the experience is understood. And that pattern has structure. It often includes loss of control over the body, a sense of being observed, movement that isn't self-directed, a shift in environment or perspective. Those elements line up in a way that feels familiar to certain narratives. And when the mind looks for a way to explain what just happened, it tends to reach for something that matches the structure. Not because it's proven, but because it fits. Because it organizes the experience into something that feels coherent. That doesn't mean the explanation is external, but it does show how quickly the brain assigns identity to something it doesn't fully understand. The process isn't unique to this kind of experience. It happens in other areas too. We talk about this all the time. But we're going to recap. When perception is incomplete, when context is limited, when something doesn't line up with expectations, the mind fills in the gaps. It builds a model. It creates a version of events that makes sense within the framework it has available. In everyday life, the process is very subtle. It happens without much attention at all. But in an experience like this, it becomes more visible because the gap between what happened and how it's explained is larger, more noticeable, and more personal. There's also something else happening here: control, or lack thereof it. Most of our experience is built around the assumption that we can move when we want to, that we can change our position, adjust our environment, respond to what's happening around us. When that assumption breaks, even briefly, it creates tension, because the system we rely on isn't responding the way it should. When that loss of control is paired with movement that feels external, it intensifies the experience. Because now, it's not just that you can't move, it's that something is moving you. Or it feels like it is. Even in that moment, it's being generated internally. Even if it's a product of how the brain is processing the state that it's in. The perception of it carries weight. It feels like an event. Something happening, not something imagined. That distinction matters because it changes how the experience is remembered. It doesn't get filed away as a thought. It gets stored as something that occurred, something that was lived through. That makes it much harder to dismiss, harder to reduce to a simple explanation, even when explanations exist. Even when you can point to a sleep disruption, to a neurological overlap, to known patterns in how the brain behaves in certain states. All of that can be true, and the experience can feel like something more. Not because it is, but because of how it was perceived. That's the part that stays with people. Not the details, not the exact sequence of events. The feeling, the sense of being somewhere else or being moved within a space that felt so real. The sense that for a moment the normal rules just don't apply. And that memory doesn't always fade away. It lingers. It shows up in quiet moments when you're trying to fall asleep, when the room is still, when awareness starts to shift again. There's a brief pause, a moment of recognition. Not fear necessarily, just awareness that this state exists, that it can happen, that the boundary between awaking and something else isn't as fixed as it feels during the day. That awareness can change how you approach it. Some people resist it, try to stay fully awake, avoid slipping into the in-between state. Others become more curious, less reactive, trying to understand the pattern, trying to stay present without engaging the fear. Both responses make sense because the experience sits in an uncertain space, not fully explained, not fully predictable, and deeply personal. Which brings things back to something simple. Not what it is, but how it feels. That moment where your sense of position shifts, where your body doesn't respond the way it should, where movement happens without your input. And for a few seconds or longer, you're not entirely sure where you are. And once you've been there, even briefly, there's a part of you that recognizes it the next time that it starts to happen. A quiet awareness that something is shifting again. For a moment, you're back in that space. Not fully here, not fully somewhere else. Just in between, waiting to see which side you land on.